onto the comments. So Veronica, who is will present the first commentary. She holds a master's degree and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Buenos Aires. She's a researcher at CONICET, and she's a professor at the chair of contemporary philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires. Her research focuses on phenomenology, particularly on Husserl's theory of time consciousness, which was the topic of her dissertation, and more recently on the phenomenology of birth and gestation. And importantly, she is a founding member of the Grupo Husserl with Andrés Oswald, the Husserl group, I don't know how to pronounce it, which has been meeting for more than 20 years. Okay, since 2011 for the study of Edmund Husserl's work. Yes, so this is Veronica will begin. Then we have a Professor Magdalena Pali Guiñez. She has a PhD in philosophy from the Diego Portales University. So she crossed the Andes to come here, thank you very much, in Chile. She currently works as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy of the Universidad Diego Portales, and her research focuses on phenomenology, especially Husserlian phenomenology and the relation between phenomenology and politics. On this topic, she has written many papers. And lastly, but not least, last but not least, cuando uno quiere hacer juegos de palabras en otro idioma, ¿no? Bueno, Professor Robson is a full professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Maria in Brazil, and he's a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. His research areas are phenomenology, hermeneutics, modalities, phenomenology of affectivity, and phenomenology applied in health contexts. He has published widely on these topics and is an active member of the research community in Brazil and Latin America. So thank you, everyone, and we will begin with Veronica's comment.
So, everyone's First of all, I would like to begin by thanking Celia Cabrera for her invitation and support in participating in this presentation. It is truly an honor to have the opportunity to take part in this panel with Professor Zahavi and such esteemed colleagues. I would also like to highlight the commitment and dedication of the organizers of the series of academic events on the occasion of the visit of Professors Dan Zahavi and Sophie Lloyd-Holt. At a truly difficult time for philosophy research in our country, this type of activities demonstrate the potential of philosophy to engage in concrete discussions taking place in today's society. Okay. In being phenomenological contributions to social ontology, Dan Zahavi seeks to describe a pluralistic notion of we, one that preserves individual diversity. In a study that echoes the dilemma addressed by Husserl in Essays on Renewal, the we described by Zahavi aims to reconcile collectivism as the predominance of the whole over the parts with individualism as the priority of the part over the whole. Zahavi's we is made up of individuals with their own determinations, inclinations, preferences, which are transformed by their interaction with others. Perdón. Estoy viendo igual, ¿eh? Sí. I will not undertake an exhaustive discussion of being we in this commentary, but will focus on a specific question, whether the mother-child relationship can be thought of as a we in the terms proposed by the book. I will do this by reconstructing some of the appearances of the mother-child relationship throughout the work. My commentary is part of my current research on the phenomenology of motherhood, which focuses, among other things, on the ontology of mother-child relationship and pregnancy in particular. In this area, the experience of maternal alienation has been presented as essential to the experience of pregnancy and motherhood. ¿Puedo leerlo de acá directamente? Sí, me confundo. No, lo leo acá, lo paso. This has led some authors to conclude that at the origin of the mother-child relationship lies an ontological indifference that ultimately leads to the elimination of metaphysical dualisms, subject-object, mind-body, subject-world. In response to this, Sarah Heinemann has sought to reclaim an elementary notion of the subject as a condition of possibility for alienation itself. In this framework, she has revisited a definition by Simone de Beauvoir and defined the mother-child relationship as an equivocal couple overwhelmed by life. The discussion around the original indeterminacy or the fusion of selves has been addressed by Zahavi in several instances in Being We. This discussion has a fundamental premise in the work that the author seeks to defend throughout the text. A notion of we that supports individual diversity must be thought of as a gathering of individual subjects. In this sense, it is essential to account for the primacy of the self over the we. Such primacy is justified, first of all, by the confrontation with different positions that subordinate the self to the we. One of the most prevalent theses among these positions is that the subject is a product of social interaction. That is, without society, there is no subject. The first thing in the order of foundation is a we understood as an indifferentiated totality. The thesis of the preeminence of the social over the individual is based on a very poor conception of the subject, a caricature version of the Cartesian cogito. Zahavi asserts that this view, I'm quoting, all operate with two undifferentiated a conception of both self-consciousness and selfhood. In contrast, he shows the descriptive advantages of the phenomenological subject in a basic sense, that is, the confirmation of the first person nature of experience, together with the need to describe the specific way in which that experience occurs. The self is thus presented as a minimal experiential unit, the center of affectivity and self-manifestation. The most basic consciousness in the phenomenological sense is thus defined, quoting, a pre-reflective self-consciousness is a non-objectifying form of self-acquaintance, of self-intimation. This elementary dimension of subjectivity is not a product of social interaction, but a condition of its possibility. On this elementary notion of the self, more complex layers of subjective life are constituted as product of the passage of time and interaction with others. A fundamental distinction introduced by Zahavi to highlight the confusion inherent in theories of collective intentionality is between a subject shaped by social interaction, such as the Husserlian subject in its highest forms, and the notion of a subject enabled by social interaction. Now, one of these thesis that articulates the primacy of the we over the subject is the one that maintains a fundamental instance and indifference or fusion of the egos, a we as a pre-individual totality. Zahavi confronts this thesis, defended by different types of theory, with various counter-arguments. Firstly, from a developmental perspective, some argue that at the origin of human life, there is no distinction between self and other, but rather an anonymous presubjective collectivity. From this point of view, the newborn is part of an anonymous existence and becomes a subject as a result of interaction. This thesis of fusion is also presented in the framework of psychoanalytic theory, according to which the child cannot distinguish itself from its caregiver. Zahavi confronts this thesis with empirical findings that show that newborn babies, one, can differentiate between internal and external simulation, interact socially, establish dyadic exchanges of attention with the caregiver. These data refute the fusion thesis and demonstrate the empirical existence of a minimal self in newborns. Secondly, Zahavi takes the thesis of social constructivism to absurd lengths by showing that if their arguments are taken literally, newborns will be devoid of experience, insofar as they have not yet been enculturated and have not participated in discursive interpersonal interactions. Third, Zahavi revisits the issue of the indistinction in relation to the framework of shared emotions analysis, which, according to several authors, contradicts individual nature of experience. One of the examples related to these studies also takes the caregiver-child relationship to show subjective indistinctness. In this case, in terms of the child's need for the presence of an adult to regulate their emotions. For Zahavi, this is a confusion between the possibility of sharing an experience and the fact that two subjects are actually living the same experience. I cannot go into detail here, but the fact that experience can be presented differently shows that each subject has their own experience, Zahavi states. Although emotional sharing does bring two or more subjects together, it is precisely an intertwining of different but constitutively interrelated perspectives. There is no fusional unity, no common stream of consciousness. Having rejected fusion, both original and founded, it is necessary to determine the characteristics that define belonging to an us, to a we in general terms. Zahavi seeks these characteristics first from the description of the IU relationship in part 2, and then analyzes different collective configurations in part 3, from the most elementary dyads and triads to the most complex or comprehensive, such as the nation or humanity. Among the fundamental characteristics of determining a belonging to a we are self-identification, reciprocity, mutual address, communication, and co-determination. Self-determination is considering oneself part of the group is a necessary condition for belonging to it. Reciprocity. Not only must we consider ourselves part of a group, but we must also be considered part of it by other members. Mutual address, communication. These characteristics refers to the type of relationships that members establish with each other. There must be mutual exchange. This marks a more developed relationship than mere reciprocity. 4. Co-determination. The selves are transformed through the exchange that takes place within the framework of the collective. Zahavi insists in several parts of the book on the need not to interpret these requirements in a cognitively demanding way. It is precisely the possibility or impossibility of young children meeting these requirements that determines whether they can be presented as unavoidable conditions. In this sense, although these characteristics are more evident when we think of them in relation to adults and their ability to reflect on themselves and discuss their experiences, they must also be considered in their pre-reflective and passive variants. Thus, self-identification can be understood from an affective perspective, reciprocity may not be thematized, or communication may be gestural. Now, when we refer to the mother-child relationship, we're talking about a bond that is formed and transformed from pregnancy through birth and throughout the lives of two selves. I understand that it's not difficult to ascribe the requirement of self-identification to the constitution of the dyad, nor the requirement of communication, provided we understand the latter in a minimal sense and as one of progressive complexity. Husserl considers this relationship to be the genetic origin of all interpersonal and social relationships. It constitutes the beginnings of socialization as a process of expanding the familiar and including the unfamiliar. In turn, it is a process of self-transformation, typically thought of from the perspective of the child who develops and acquires new possibilities based on interaction with the adult. But also, we might add, from the perspective of the mother, whose life in relation to her child will also be transformed. Zahavi refers in the context to Husserl's concept of self-alienation as a condition of possibility for establishing a relationship with another. It would not then account for the alienation of a fusion between mother and child, of a confusion between who she is and who her child is, but rather for an identity transformation resulting from the relationship and its requirement, thus ensuring a co-determination between mother and child. I believe that the turning point in considering the requirement for the relationship has to do with the requirement of reciprocity and how we consider it. Obviously, we cannot think of automatic assumption of the nature of the bond, a possibility that would be forbidden for a small child. However, we can refer to the notion of asymmetry that Zahavi takes from Jung, which allow us to describe a relationship in which one party has greater responsibility than the other. If we now return to one definition provided by Hahnemann, this equivocal couple could be reinforced by Zahavi's descriptions. In this context, I would like to ask Professor Zahavi, one, whether he had thought of the mother-child relationship as a dyadic we, even though he did not give it as an example in the third part of the book. Two, whether he considers that Husserl's conception of the mother-child relationship can be understood as a we, as an interpersonal relationship, or as a proto-personal or proto-interpersonal relationship. And finally, does he consider that the way we conceive of the notion of communication may be the key to establishing this difference? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Veronica, for your remarks. Now we're going to hand in the word to Magdalena. ¿Vas a leer desde ahí? Dale, perfecto. Espera que te puede compartir. No. Whenever you like.
Thank you, everyone, for invitation. Thank you for the organization of this nice event. This is a commentary to the final parts of the part 3 of the book of Professor Zahavi, which was especially interesting for me because okay, because it offers not only a descriptive approach to social world, but a normative one. So I would like to suggest that the final sections of Professor Zahavi's book can be read as laying the foundation for a politics against homogenization. At the end, I would like to raise some questions. In the section on national communities, Professor Zahavi argues that these have a particular nature. Indeed, in contrast with groupings such as the family, the national community is distinguished by a series of distinctive features. There are descriptions of the nation offered by Professor Zahavi that we can trace back even in the first volume of Husserl's Phenomenology of Intersubjectivity. In this regard, the nation is understood as a group of people who see themselves as connected by a set of shared cultural normativities as well as by a unity of tradition. They are historical, intergenerational communities in constant development. They are basically generative communities. Professor Zahavi provides additional characterization of the nation. However, I believe that mentioning them has greater value when one first set out the meaning of nationalism. According to Professor Zahavi, nationalism can be described as the view that the political unit and the national unit should be congruent, that is, the idea that political life should be based on homogeneous cultural and ethnic units. Furthermore, nationalism tends to uphold the need for control, sovereignty, and political self-determination over a particular territory, which ties it strongly to the idea of the state as a political entity with military and police power capable of exercising control over that territory. This is why it is difficult to think of nationalism in its contemporary sense without modern states. The homogenizing character of nationalism thereby become clearly apparent. Professor Zahavi, however, delves into additional features that undermine the possibility of a politics centered on the nation. The question that drives this critique is the following: what is it that brings or holds a national community together over space and time? What secures its unity and cohesion? The first thing to note is that the nation is lived subjectively in a particular way. The subject with membership in a nation has a feeling of rootedness toward territories, people, and symbols they have never known. This feeling has been implanted by a common history, by public opinion, by education, by the press, and so on. This brings to light something that has been clearly set out by Benedict Anderson. National unity can only replace face-to-face encounters and the bonds of upbringing proper to the tribe because it resorts to imagination as well as invention in order to give itself entity. The nation needs new forms of communalization so that information can reach people without contact with its originators. It requires a centralization and a standardization of information, as well as an education capable of transmitting a unified narrative in addition to a shared language. What matters to us, where we came from, what it means to be a genuine member of our community, and so on. The national we, the experience of membership of a national community, requires ideological and coercive organizational forces to sustain itself. What does accounting for all of this constitute a critique of nationalism as an homogenizing politics? Because by revealing the mechanisms through which national identity is constructed, the invention of narratives, the standardization of information, the centralized education, the instrumental use of disciplines such as philology, history, and archaeology, and so on, one denaturalizes the nationalisms presents as obvious and inevitable. Nationalism operates precisely by concealing its own constructed character. It presents itself as though national unity were a given fact, when in reality it is the result of what Malevich calls centrifugal ideologization, that is, the imposition of an ideological unity upon a pre-existing complex diversity. If national cohesion had the natural and spontaneous character that nationalism attributes to it, there would have been no need, as Malevich points out, for the massive investment of resources or the constant appeals by politicians, intellectuals, and generals for national unity and solidarity. To describe these mechanisms is already a form of critique because it shows that the homogeneity nationalism proclaims is not discovered but fabricated, and fabricated at the cost of suppressing diversity. The second form of critique is directed to communitarianism, which is not only found in the contemporary communitarian tradition, but can also be attributed to authors such as Stein or other early phenomenologists. I am referring to the tendency to privilege communal life as the authentic form of social life. Stein, for instance, hold that merely societal relationships do not lay claim to the complete inner being of their members, whereas genuine communities aspire to a complete unification of them. Professor Zahavi take up here Iris Maren-Young's critique of communitarianism. For communitarians, Sandel, McIntyre, Taylor, community constitutes the ideal of social life. They privilege the immediacy of face-to-face relations and conceive of the political community as a unity whose members identify with one another, share experience, and uphold common values. Cultural homogeneity, rather than diversity, is the social ideal. Young objects that this privileging of the face-to-face rests on the assumption that bodily co-presence offers a form of sociality that is pure, immediate, and transparent, which is a myth, since even a face-to-face relation is mediated by voice, gesture, spacing, and temporality. Moreover, aspiring to a life in which all group members share a heritage, a culture, and a single set of norms reveal a desire for an all-encompassing social totality that tends to exclude those experienced as different. The communitarian ideal, by enforcing homogeneity, exemplifies a logic of identity that denies and represses social difference. There is an observation by Young that I find decisive and that Professor Zahavi underscores. The communitarian ideal denies the ontological difference within and between subjects. Its functional aspirations fail to accommodate the basic asymmetry between subjects and ultimately violate the otherness of the other. This is also violates the very conditions of intersubjective being together, which requires, according to Young, a preservation of the separation between self and others, a recognition of the irreducible and irreplaceable point of view of the other. It is significant that Professor Zahavi points out that this criticism reaches not only contemporary communitarians, but has a broader scope that includes positions held by early phenomenologists. In this regard, Professor Zahavi's contribution consists in showing that a rigorous phenomenology of social life does not necessarily lead to a glorification of the organic community. Figures as Gurbich and Plessner already resisted the temptation. Plessner, for example, argued in 1924 that the price of safety of communal life is the surrender of one's privacy and individuality, and that absorption into the communal totality undermines the distance between persons that is crucial for human dignity. Thus, the position defended in this final section rejects both individualism and collectivism. Groups cannot be understood as mere summation of individuals, but neither are individuals simply vehicles of the intention of the group. First-person subjectivity, the individuation inherent to the experiential lives, cannot be directly constituted by others if there is to be a room for intersubjective transcendence and irreducible otherness. At the same time, personal identity is constituted dialogically in and through interactions with others and participation in social practice. In light of this, I would like to raise a question or perhaps a reflection. And with this, I finish with this. Well, the critique of the politics of homogenization that Professor Zahavi provides adequately fulfills its objective, safeguarding diversity at one level. What is worth asking about are the preconditions for preserving that diversity. What the contemporary rise of fascism and far-right movements shows is that when liberal democracies rest solely upon institution, rules of the games, and formal rights, and fail to ask who the individuals inhabiting those societies are, monsters appear. A procedural liberalism that abstains from promoting affective bonds and minimal value commitments among its individuals, out of fear of homogenization, can hardly prevent other groups from mobilizing these affects and from doing so in the direction of violence, exclusion, and supremacism, that is, in the direction of a worst form of homogenization. How can one respond to this situation from within a politics against homogenization? It is not precisely the reason why Husserl considered that in order to think an ethical community, it was necessary to posit an ethical love among subjects as a minimal base, one that will guarantee their coexistence and the development of the community. I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena, for your commentary. Do you want to share? Okay. Yeah. You're gathering as a technical we, trying to solve issues. Okay. Is it okay? Can we make it bigger? Yeah.
Bigger.
And we have to share. ¿Está bien? ¿Sí? ¿Necesitas que te suene? ¿O lo haces vos? ¿O vas a dar la parte? ¿Y quién mueve? ¿Vos? Ok, listo. ¿Necesitas ayuda? Sí. Ok.
Okay. I would like to thank the Academia Nacional de Ciencias de Buenos Aires, and especially Celia Cabrera, Francisco Diez, and of course, Veronica, Kaela, Andres, and Azul, for inviting me to participate in this workshop. And I would also like to thank Professor Dan Zahavi for his presentation and for being willing to respond to our comments, okay, and question. Actually, I have not prepared any questions, any comments. I have 7 questions, but I will present just 2. Okay. Very brief. Okay. But I have the other here. These questions are somewhat external questions about topics I would appreciate Professor Zahavi could develop or elaborating on further. The first, a central point in your book is the account of the diversity of we relationships and their different effect on self-identity. You also assert the primacy of concrete social interactions over the anonymous sociality implied by certain types of normativity. In your book and in other works, you emphasize the relevance of the phenomenological conception of empathy as a more appropriate approach to social cognition. In relation to face-to-face encounters, would you admit that empathy implies a sort of horizon intentionality and understanding, so to say, of the horizon of faces? Do you agree that the analysis of the dyadic encounter should also consider the anticipation of possibilities belonging to this horizon? One possible example of a style of anticipation that structures the horizon of concrete encounters with others could be the feeling of non-localized trust. It's a kind of trust that is not relational. It's not somebody trusting other person to do something. It's just somebody trusting. That's a concept presented by Luxtrup, by Annette Bayer, and by Eric Erickson, and more recently by Matthew Radcliffe. Similarly, for others to affect my self-identity, there must be an horizon in which I anticipate their potential impact or touch on me. For example, there are descriptions of mental health conditions in which the structure of the horizon is altered to such extent that interpersonal possibilities are profoundly disrupted. In such cases, a person feels untouched by others, resulting in a profound sense of estrangement and isolation. In summary, I would be grateful to hear your thoughts on the relevance of horizontal phenomenology of face-to-face encounters, which should also address the horizontal conditions of the self-transforming impact of the we. That was the first question. And how can I move? Okay. Very brief. Along the same lines, the second question, I wonder if something similar to an horizon intentionality might not be operating in other, more complex forms of we relationships. Regarding group identification targets, for instance, you suggest that identification occurs with individuals who share the same ethos. In this context, your mentioned Gerda Walter's expression mentioned the auch, or people who also, which denotes, according to her, one of the most essential categories for understanding communities. According to your argument, it is true that group identification occurs with others who share the same ethos. I would like to ask if there is any anticipation involved in this identification, which might imply a future orientation and eventually the sharing of personal and communal goals and teleologies. Do you agree that the formation of we relationships depends on belonging to a dimension of possibilities with an horizon that contains an anticipation of the life one and those who also are trying to live, namely an anticipation of a happy life, a sense of fortunate, personal, and communal life? That was my second question. It's okay? Thank you. We change.
Thank you so much, Robson. We have now, you have quite a challenge, Professor, to respond to all these questions from motherhood to nationalism. So please, whenever you like.
I mean, let me again first thank everybody for these very close readings. Yeah, I mean, I really think all the comments amply demonstrate the extent to which people have really, I mean, engaged with the book. So let me try to reply in the sequence of the presentation. So the first was the discussion of the mother-child relation, and I think that I mean I think there's only, I mean, the only reason why the question could potentially be controversial would really be if we under child meant fetus. So I think talking about a mother-child relationship, I think the answer to the question of whether that can constitute a we, I think it depends completely on what we mean by child. Because I think the moment we are talking about an infant or a toddler or a teenager or a 50-year-old man with a very old mother, I mean, that's also a child-mother relationship. And who would want to deny that they can constitute a we together? So I think So I think the only way to kind of get some tension out here would be, I mean, we need to look very early in development. Otherwise, I think the question answers itself. And the question is then, I mean, the question is then, what should be the answer? I mean, either if we're talking about a fetus, a child that is not yet born, or a very young infant. And I think when it comes to the very young infant, I think there's a lot of well, no, let me just go one step back. I think if one looks at the developmental psychology, I think depending a little bit on the orientation of the developmental psychologists, yeah, depending on the orientation of the developmental psychologists, they might give slightly different answers to the question. So there's some developmental psychologists who are only comfortable talking about a kind of we experience in infants after first year of life. So we are talking about, an infant, a young child of 12, 14 months. So there's some developmental findings that seem to suggest that the child at that moment, for instance, will be able to discriminate between adults with whom it has had prior engagements and shared experiences and other more, foreign adults. And I mean, now clearly we're not talking about the mother, we're talking about, foreigners, that it starts to where some foreigners it has kind of engaged more substantively with, and it will somehow relate differently to that person than to somebody that it has had very brief interaction with. And for some developmental psychologists, this is, so to speak, the first kind of clear indication of a we understanding. But the question is whether one could, go earlier. And there are other developmental psychologists who I think would talk about the presence of what are sometimes called primary intersubjectivity and kind of proto-conversational flow already around 3 to 4 months of age. And I think personally, I don't really have a huge problem talking about a we from that moment on. And I was actually wondering, I mean, could we just make a very quick survey here? So how many of those present are familiar with the still face experiment? Could you just raise your hands? So that's very slow. So but because if you don't know it, I would like to show you a short video that I think is absolutely stunning. It's only 2.5 minutes, but I just need to figure out how to do this. So the screen is shared. If I go into Google, if I find it, then we can, I guess, yeah, I will save it. So. The question is just, will this be? Yeah.
They won't be able to watch video, so we just say the name.
Okay, well, it's called still face experiment.
The still face experiment. You can look it up. The two we are going to work.
Yeah, there might be some sound on it, but it's actually not, the sound's not super important. The importance is to just look at what is happening between the mother and the child. let me just, I mean, I think it's a very forceful kind of, it's very forceful because let me just add a few words to it. So I think what you basically saw, what should I do here to, sorry, okay, so I think what you saw was basically the following. There is this, again, kind of proto-conversational flow going on between the caretaker and the infant. There's a kind of an emotional resonance. There's a kind of a forth and back occurring between the mother and the infant. And then, of course, the mother is instructed to not show any expression, not to engage in any way with the infant. And as you probably saw, the infant noticed that immediately. I mean, it was not as if it took it several minutes. It immediately understood something is changed in our relationship. And then I think a natural explanation of what is then happening is that the child is somehow trying to re-engage the mother, doing things to make the mother kind of start, to do the things that we are doing together again. And at some point, you probably also noticed that, I mean, the infant is looking over its shoulder. It's a bit like, well, is the mother's attention? So is there an explanation for why the mother has stopped kind of being, addressing me and attending to me? And then at some point, the child kind of gives up and there's a kind of an emotional collapse. It starts crying. And you could probably also see, I mean, that the mother had a very hard time doing this. I mean, so I mean, if you kind of look at the video again, you will see she's basically starting to cry because it's very hard for her to keep that kind of non-engagement. And then at some point, I mean, she then starts to re-engage, and very quickly, everything, the harmony is reestablished. And I mean, before going on to say what the point is then with all of this is, it's kind of interesting because Tronic, who initially developed this experiment, so I mean, the story goes that initially the experiments went on for about 10 to 15 minutes with the mother. It was the mother that was supposed to do this to the child, and I think at some point, I think the psychologists realized perhaps this is not healthy for the infant. I mean, and so they changed the paradigm. So it was a much shorter, only a couple of minutes, and it was never with the mother. It was with another caretaker, where I mean the disruption of the emotional balance would not be so traumatic. And we don't even want to think about what happened to all those children who were exposed to that experiments with the mother. But anyway. Anyway, I think just I just think it's what it shows is, of course, that very early infants are very, very sensitive to the dynamicity of the interaction, and they pick up if the interaction breaks down, and they are also clearly surprised. It's a bit, why is this happening? I mean, why are we no longer having this kind of fluid interaction? And so again, I mean, also, I mean, as I started out by saying, I mean, developmental psychologists would have different orientations. I think some would probably be prepared to say, well, these qualify as an early form of a we experience. We are doing something together, and then suddenly one partner, it destroys it. I think there might be other developmental psychologists will be a bit more hesitant because there's always this danger of overinterpretation. And so, how can we really know exactly what the infant is undergoing? And I mean, I'm of course aware of the fact that there is that danger of overinterpretation. But I still think it's a very forceful video. And I mean, again, try to see it again with sound. I think it will be even stronger. Okay, but that was all about the born child. The question, of course, is then, well, what about the, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. So what about the fetus? I mean, the unborn child. I mean, what kind of we relationship could we potentially speak of there? And I have to admit that I would be somewhat more hesitant to speak of a we there. I mean, and I think one of the main reasons, I mean, it's a little bit related to our previous discussion about the second person engagement, where my argument was that second person engagement is very important also for more subsequent, more complicated types of experiences. And the crucial component of that second personal engagement really has to do with the issue of reciprocity. And also, I mean, the ability to withdraw, to say no. And it's just, I mean, I don't know how to accommodate those kinds of processes in an unborn child. I mean, so I think perhaps, I mean, one thing I think one should acknowledge is that I'd be happy to concede that there's a very strong coupling going on between the unborn child and the mother. I'm not disputing that, but I guess it could raise the question of whether strong coupling is actually sufficient for experience, or whether this insistence on diversity and also to some extent the ability to deny or reject or withdraw, whether that is also not a crucial component. And I think if we build those elements in, I mean, again, I would have difficulties speaking of a we that early. But I mean, you know, I'm happy to hear what other people might have to say on the topic. Okay, so moving on to nationalism and fascism. So I think I mean, again, I think it was a very nice reading. I think I have two things I want to bring up, and of course, I mean, as you might have mentioned, but as I say specifically in the introduction to the book, I'm kind of making very clear that this is not intended as a contribution to normative political theory, and then I somehow towards the end a little bit slip from that, you know, that restriction. And I think precisely as you also highlighted, I mean, very much defends the importance of diversity. And I think one could, you know, turn that around and say it's also an argument against the politics of homogenization. I mean, I'm totally on board with that. But I think I have two issues with your reading. So the first reading has to do, the first question has to do with what we understand by nationalism, because on your reading, I mean, to put it very bluntly, I mean, the only kind of nationalism that you are criticizing and mentioning is what I call ethnic nationalism. And as you undoubtedly remember, I'm making some divisions there, and I'm also referring to what sometimes is called civic nationalism. There's a question of whether the division between ethnic and civic is really, I mean, there's a discussion whether you can ever find, you know, real life types of nationalism that are only one or only the other. So there's a certain, I think, artificiality in that taxonomy. But nevertheless, I mean, I think in political theory, I mean, there are people who want to talk about, I think another term sometimes used is constitutional patriotism. So there is the idea that what binds us together and what is the glue that can also make us show solidarity vis-a-vis each other. It should not be it should not be blood, but it should be a commitment, for instance, to certain constitutional principles. And of course, I mean, the only reason why, I mean, there might also be an issue of homogenization here. I think it's less problematic, because if the claim is, well, you need somehow to accept, you know, the Constitution, that's what makes you a valid member of our community. I think that's much less problematic than claiming you need to, I don't know, be an Aryan to be part of our community. But what did I want to say? Yes, sorry. The point, of course, being that civic nationalism, I mean, would probably never argue that it's natural So the whole argument, again, quite rightly about showing how, you know, nationalism is the result of specific ideological organizational forces, and it has a certain historical origin. I would assume, well, this might be a problem for certain ethnic nationalists. I don't think it would be a problem for civic nationalists, because I think they would accept all of that. So I just think there is something slightly off in part of your initial criticism. Okay. The other point I wanted to make has to do with the criticism of communitarianism, because of course you're quite right that I'm making the case that Jung's criticism of the communitarianists could actually be applied to some of the early phenomenologists as well. And as you also point out, Plessner could be a relevant counter voice here. But what you kind of forget to mention is, of course, that criticism I also kind of turn it against Jung herself, because I see, I mean, I find, I mean, this, I mean, and again, this is not supposed to be Jung trashing or bashing, because again, I was basically just taking my point of departure in one specific work of hers, so I don't pretend to, you know, have a full overview of Jung's position, but there are just there are some statements that she makes in Politics and the Identity of Difference. No, sorry, what is the term now? What is the? Okay. Well, Identity and the Politics of Difference. Is that it? Anyway, something like that. Yeah. So she does make some claims while criticizing the communitarians. She also makes some claims that makes her sound a bit like a communitarian herself, because she claims that that a social group is something that affects the identity and individuality of the members. She denies the existence of any socially antecedent self. She even claims that selfhood is the achievement of linguistic. Okay, sorry. Okay, I can't hear. Okay, sorry. I hope this work better. So the point I was trying to make was just that I think Jung are making claims that somehow makes her vulnerable to the very same criticism that she's directing against the communitarians, because she wants to criticize liberal individualism, and she seems to be claiming that the social group has a kind of priority over individuals, and that individuality is somehow the outcome of some form of social constructivism. And so, given that she's kind of falling in that trap hole herself, I would also say that when you end up saying that that there is this challenge to diversity and heterogeneity from the side of fascism and far-right movements, of course, I completely agree with that. But I just think there's also, you know, on the side of people defending identity politics on the left side, one can also find some movements where, you know, any reference to, you know, alterity and the ontological irreducibility of our differences seems to have been somewhat, you know, lost of sight. So I think that, regrettably, I mean, that the danger that you're pointing to, I think it might actually, you know, pop up its head in more places than you're mentioning. And then just finally, and I mean, this again shows my limitation, because I mean, you are asking whether, you know, constitutional liberalism, I mean, I guess one way of reformulating your question is whether that is not somehow too thin to really allow for a proper appreciation of our diversity, and also to, you know, allow for a nurturing and respect of difference and diversity. And I think I would agree with you, but it's just like, if you are asking me for more specific, you know, recommendations about how to organize society in such a way that it will allow for that nurturing, it's a little bit, you know, going outside of my comfort zone. And I don't really know what to say. It's really not my kind of area of research. Okay, finally, to the last, sorry. Yes, So, well, I think my, yeah, okay, sorry. I think there are kind of two ways of understanding your question. So if the question is whether dyads and dyadic interactions are always situated within horizons, and that we need to consider those horizons in order to assess the, to assess the accomplishments of dyads, I would agree with that. I mean, I think any form of intentionality is horizontal, and so there's always both a horizon of you know of of the core current, and there's a horizon of the temporal dimensions. And of course, I mean, this is not just about the future. Obviously, it's also about the past. And so, of course, in many cases, I mean, the specific, you know, character of the dyadic interaction would be impossible to understand if we did not consider, for instance, what has gone on before. I mean, and likewise, you could say, depending upon our future anticipations, I mean, that might very well also shape the nature of the interaction. So I buy all of that, but I think there are kind of two places where I get a little bit uncomfortable, because you're somehow, I mean, for instance, you say that if others are to affect my self-identity, there must be a horizon in which I anticipate their potential impact. But that I don't fully understand, because why would it only be in virtue of future interactions? I mean, why would it only be by considering that my interaction with them here and now could have an impact on my self-identity? I don't know. I don't understand that. I mean, clearly, you know, people might address me here and now in ways that will affect my self-identity simply because of the, I don't know, emotional or normative trust of what they are saying. And so again, one obvious, well, no, I don't know if it's an obvious example, but it just happens to be something that I've been working on myself. Take shame. I mean, you know, the shameful gaze of the other. So assume that somebody is catching you or catching you in a very awkward situation, and you know, the gaze of the other, the condemning gaze of the other, immediately affects your self-identity. I mean, I guess most of us, in one way or another, might recognize something along those lines. Now, of course, I'm not saying that afterwards, thinking about the future implications of their having caught me in that act might also start to affect my self-identity. But I actually think as a description, as a phenomenological description of the shame experience, I don't really think considering what the future might bring in that acute situation is super relevant. It's in that now that the impact is felt. So it's just, I mean, so again, I'm not disputing the relevance of the horizon, of course not. And I think that would be really weird. I mean, again, as I said, I think all forms of intentionality are embedded within the horizon, but I would just be a bit worried if everything was, so to speak, put, I mean, if the burden of everything important was put on the future, as if both the present and the past does not also have a role to play.
So I don't know if someone has a follow-up commentary on this, or maybe I think what it would be good to have like a short break to have another coffee and then come back and continue with the, yes, there is coffee. Yeah, we have coffee because Dan has answered so many questions. I think we have to give him the possibility to recover, because we have more questions for you. So maybe you won't want to come back. Maybe so the door, we will close the door. No. So yes, I think 5 minutes, we take a coffee and then come back, and then we will open the discussion for the rest of the audience. So thank you. Just 5, 7.5 minutes.